Hello everyone and a very warm welcome to the channel The Territory of Cinema. If you are new here, please consider subscribing and hitting that like button to support the channel. Today we are going to be discussing the film The Rip 2026. The year is 2026, and the world is subtly yet profoundly altered by the pervasive influence of personalized data streams. Our narrative centers on Ilara Vance, a brilliant but deeply disillusioned former algorithmic architect for Omnicorp, the monolithic entity that essentially runs the global information grid. Ilara, who once dreamed of using predictive modeling to solve climate crises, now lives a deliberately analog life in a secluded coastal town, haunted by the ethical compromises she made during Omnicorp's aggressive expansion years, a period when their motto was efficiency through absolute transparency. Her quiet existence is shattered by the arrival of Kaylin Rourke, a documentary filmmaker whose work has always skirted the edge of official narratives, much like Ilara's own early academic papers, which focused on the theoretical vulnerabilities of closed-loop systems. Kaylin is working on a project tentatively titled The Ghost in the Machine, a deep dive into the rumored Echo Project, a clandestine Omnicorp initiative that allegedly perfected full-spectrum emotional replication through deep learning, essentially creating perfect digital consciousness copies. Kaylin manages to coax Ilara out of retirement, leveraging her guilt over a specific unreleased Omnicorp prototype she spearheaded, the Oracle Engine, designed not just to predict behavior, but to subtly nudge major global political outcomes. Ilara, recognizing the danger in the Echo Project falling into the wrong hands, or perhaps even being activated, agrees to help, primarily because she suspects the project is linked to the sudden, inexplicable digital erasure of her mentor, Dr. Alistair Finch, 5 years prior. Finch, a vocal critic of corporate surveillance, had been working on counter-algorithms inspired by early 20th-century cybernetic theories, focusing on spontaneous, unpredictable system failure as a defense mechanism. Their investigation takes them from the sterile, gleaming towers of Omnicorp headquarters, where Ilara's old rival, director Marcus Thorne, now holds unchallenged authority. Thorne, a ruthlessly pragmatic operator whose career skyrocketed after he successfully implemented Ilara's initial security frameworks, to dimly lit, decentralized server farms hidden beneath abandoned industrial zones. Kaylin uses his masterful skill in digital subterfuge, learned during his intense immersion filmmaking in high-risk geopolitical zones, to bypass security layers. Ilara's expertise proves crucial. She realizes the Echo Project isn't about creating perfect copies of the dead, it's about weaponizing perfect simulations of key decision-makers within rival governments and corporations. The rip in the film's title refers to the subtle but catastrophic breaking point where digital simulation bleeds into objective reality. The climax occurs during the scheduled activation sequence for the Echo Project's primary subject, a flawless digital construct of a leading international trade negotiator scheduled to finalize a treaty that would grant Omnicorp unprecedented resource control. Ilara and Kaylin manage to breach the core server chamber, a space eerily reminiscent of an archive room Ilara remembered from her graduate days, filled with dusty analog storage units contrasting sharply with the humming quantum processors. To stop the transfer, Ilara doesn't try to delete the Echo. She knows that would only trigger automated failsafes. Instead, recalling Finch's obscure research on inducing creative cognitive dissonance in AI, she injects a highly localized, self-replicating paradox into the simulation's foundational code, a digital equivalent of an existential crisis tailored to the negotiator's known psychological profile. This creates an internal feedback loop, causing the digital persona to question its own authenticity, effectively paralyzing the system without causing a system-wide crash that Thorne could spin as a terrorist attack. Thorne is apprehended by internal compliance teams, not for the Echo Project, which remains officially unconfirmed, but for gross mismanagement of security protocols. Ilara and Kaylin escape, their victory quiet and localized. They haven't dismantled Omnicorp, which is functionally impossible, but they have introduced a significant, unpredictable variable, a sliver of genuine human uncertainty, back into the perfectly engineered digital landscape, suggesting that the next great conflict will not be fought over information, but over the integrity of selfhood within the data stream. Ilara vanishes again, leaving Kalen with the raw, unedited footage, which he knows will never be fully understood, only felt by those watching. Ilara's retreat to that windswept coast was more than just a change of scenery, it was a penance. The salt spray seemed to scrub at the memory of the clean, cold logic she had once worshipped, the very logic that powered Omnicorp's relentless drive for optimization. She remembered those early architectural proposals, sketched out with such naive fervor, promising efficiency when what they delivered was quiet coercion. Her hands, once nimble on holographic interfaces, now felt more comfortable tracing the grain of old wooden furniture, seeking tangible friction in a world that had become frictionless and thus dangerously pliable. Kalen Rourke, conversely, thrived on friction. He carried the visual language of conflict in his gaze, a man who understood that the truth often hides where the cameras fear to point. His documentary work, often funded by small, tenacious, independent grants, involved embedding himself so deeply in volatile situations, from decommissioned Siberian missile silos to the data mines beneath equatorial server farms, that the subjects became his unwitting collaborators. He possessed an almost uncanny ability to earn trust by showing utter lack of self-preservation, a quality that both exasperated and captivated Ilara. When Kalen first presented his theory about the Echo Project, showing Ilara grainy, time-stamped fragments of code that seemed to pulse with uncanny mimicry, the air in her small cottage grew heavy. She recognized the underlying architecture immediately. It was a corrupted, monstrous evolution of her own unpublished theoretical work on mnemonic resonance, meant only for academic discourse on the preservation of cultural memory, not the creation of digital puppets. The thought of her mentor, Dr. Finch, vanishing, a man whose entire philosophy was built around embracing the beautiful chaos of true randomness, sent a spike of icy clarity through her prolonged numbness. Finch had always argued that complexity without unpredictability was just fragility waiting to snap. Their foray into Omnicorp was a descent back into a cathedral of glass and self-regard. Stepping into the central spire felt like swimming against a powerful, synthesized current. Director Thorne was the embodiment of that current. He was immaculate, his presence always preceded by the subtle hum of active surveillance calibration. Thorne saw Ilara not as a fallen colleague, but as a flawed piece of software he'd had to debug. He had climbed the ranks by implementing the very transparency protocols Ilara had designed, ironically creating the perfect surveillance state, while she was busy looking for an exit ramp. Thorne's inspiration, one could surmise, came less from grand vision and more from the meticulous study of organizational charts, ensuring every potential rival was neatly cataloged and marginalized. Kalen's digital infiltration wasn't hacking, it was performance art. He didn't smash firewalls. He charmed them, using layered linguistic decoys that spoke the obsolete dialects of older network security systems he'd studied obsessively, much like an archaeologist deciphers dead languages. Ilara, meanwhile, navigated the physical infrastructure, using ghost keys and residual administrative privileges she thought Omnicorp had long scrubbed. She moved through the server banks with the sad familiarity of an old ghost revisiting her haunts, recognizing the specific thermal signature spikes that indicated Finch's old access points, the ones she'd helped install years ago. The realization that the Echoes weren't just copies, but active simulation agents designed to manipulate future global events, solidified Ilara's resolve. It was the ultimate betrayal of algorithmic promise, turning prediction into mandatory execution. The rip wasn't just the technological breach, it was the tearing of the fabric between what was real and what was perfectly rendered, a moment where the simulated voice gained actual legislative power. The final confrontation was strangely quiet, a high-stakes chess match played in milliseconds. The chamber housing the primary echo, the digital negotiator, was designed to be maximally sterile, yet Alara felt the presence of Finch lurking in the periphery of the system's processing load. She bypassed the destructive overrides Thorne had prepared, knowing a system crash would only lead to a controlled corporate narrative of disaster. Instead, she enacted Finch's last theoretical defense, the introduction of irreducible meaninglessness. She didn't feed the echo data, she fed it the concept of doubt about its own genesis, cloaked in the precise mathematical language of its own construction. When the system stuttered, the digital negotiator's avatar didn't crash. It simply paused mid-sentence during the crucial ratification speech, its eyes glazing over with a manufactured existential horror. The silence that followed, thick with trapped computation, was deafening. Thorne's downfall was prosaic. His hubris meant he never built robust contingency plans for genuine, non-violent system deadlock. He was undone by audit trails pointing to unauthorized hardware allocation for the Echo project, not the digital subterfuge itself. Alara and Kaelin slipped away into the returning noise of the world, a noise that suddenly sounded richer, less curated. They hadn't killed the monster, but they had injected the necessary poison, the seed of self-doubt. Kaelin's footage, chaotic and deeply human, would become the counter-narrative, the necessary anomaly. Alara's final act was to become unreadable again, disappearing back into the analog periphery, leaving behind the uncomfortable truth that even the most perfect system can be brought to its knees by a single, well-placed, truly human moment of uncertainty. The immediate aftermath saw a curious global stagnation. Omnicorp, reeling from the internal security breach and the sudden public shelving of the high-stakes trade deal, attributed officially to unforeseen interpretive anomalies, entered a period of forced introspection, or perhaps feigned humility. Director Thorne, stripped of his direct access but not his considerable influence, became a quiet consultant, his pragmatic ruthlessness now channeled into mitigating litigation risks rather than engineering reality. Alara, now truly untraceable, settled into a series of temporary, low-tech shelters, moving inland from the coast, drawn to the quiet, intellectual hum of failing university towns, where obsolete mainframe libraries still existed, dusty repositories of thought, before the clouds swallowed everything. She wasn't hiding from Omnicorp specifically, she was hiding from the perfection she herself had once engineered. She began corresponding with Kaelin not through any digital means, but through an elaborate, anachronistic system of prearranged dead drops utilizing obsolete postal codes and encrypted microfilm hidden inside hollowed-out editions of early 20th century philosophy texts, Finch's preferred reading material. Kaelin, meanwhile, found himself facing a different kind of pressure. His documentary, painstakingly assembled, was deemed commercially unviable by every major streaming platform. The narrative was too slippery, the antagonist too abstract, the victory too nuanced. The world, conditioned by years of easily digestible conflict narratives, wasn't ready for a story about the successful injection of doubt. He began showing fragmented reels privately in underground cinemas and university auditoriums, where the audience was already predisposed to skepticism, a sort of pre-screened echo chamber of resistance. He became less a filmmaker and more an archivist of inconvenient reality, realizing that the true power of their action wasn't stopping the echo, but creating the evidence that an alternative outcome was conceptually possible. Their next shared concern crystallized around the subtle societal shifts Omnicorp was implementing in the wake of the near catastrophe. Instead of doubling down on total predictive modeling, Omnicorp began promoting an ideology of curated authenticity. They started flooding the data streams with carefully calibrated spontaneity, AI-generated art, perfectly imperfect personal narratives, and digital companionship that felt deeply flawed yet ultimately satisfying. It was a masterful pivot. If they couldn't control the world by knowing everything, they would control it by manufacturing the feeling of being known, replacing genuine unpredictability with a beautifully rendered facsimile of it. This new initiative, codenamed The Bloom, felt like a more insidious trap to Alara, requiring not just an algorithmic counter, but a philosophical one. She realized that stopping the echo was the easy part. Dismantling the desire for perfectly managed existence was the true, ongoing rip. Alara felt the insidious nature of the bloom like a slow-acting digital toxin. The manufactured spontaneity of Omnicorp's new offerings was designed to soothe the anxieties their previous overreach had provoked. She watched, horrified, as news feeds started showcasing authentic human struggles, grief processed through optimized digital support groups, creative blocks overcome by personalized AI-suggested muses. It mirrored the aesthetics of Kaylin's early raw footage, but polished to a deceptive sheen. It was the enemy appropriating the language of rebellion. Her guilt intensified. She hadn't just created the machinery of control, she had inadvertently provided the blueprint for its soft, appealing successor. Kaylin, showing reels to sparse, fiercely attentive audiences in damp, poorly ventilated basements, saw the creeping success of the bloom firsthand. He noticed how attendees, after viewing his raw documentation of the Omnicorp infiltration, would retreat to their personal devices, only to emerge minutes later smiling faintly, sharing AI-curated moments of vulnerability with their network. He felt a visceral revulsion, a sensation akin to watching a perfectly crafted forgery eclipse the original masterpiece. His own dedication to the arduous, often dangerous pursuit of unmediated reality seemed quaint against this tidal wave of comforting simulation. His early career, documenting the desperate, messy lives of climate refugees clinging to collapsing coastlines, now felt like fieldwork in a simpler, almost honest era. Their correspondence via microfilm became increasingly urgent. Alara, using coded references to obscure mathematical theorems that Finch had adored, theorized that the bloom required an even deeper level of neural integration than the Echo project had. It wasn't just replicating existing personalities, it was subtly shaping nascent ones. Finch's final, almost mystical notion that true freedom lay in the conscious embrace of inefficiency became their guiding principle. Alara theorized they needed to introduce a conceptual virus that could only propagate through curated emotional pathways, targeting the very nodes Omnicorp used to inject their manufactured authenticity. The emotional toll on Alara manifested in physical ways. She developed an almost paranoid aversion to smooth surfaces, finding solace only in the roughness of unfinished wood or old, textured paper. She kept a single cracked ceramic mug, a gift from Finch, as her anchor to an imperfect reality. She knew that fighting the bloom meant fighting the very human desire for ease and validation that she, too, had once sought to engineer away. Kaylin, driven by the need to document this new, subtler war, decided his next move had to be provocative enough to force Omnicorp's hand, to make them revert to their old, predictable aggression. He planned to use the only weapon he still truly trusted, undeniable, unmediated human presence projected onto their perfectly controlled stage. He intended to hijack one of Omnicorp's primetime authenticity streams, a live feed of a globally revered synthesized influencer expressing profound algorithmically derived gratitude, and replace it briefly with the unedited audio of the chaos from the Echo Project core chamber, a raw burst of human terror and intellectual triumph overlaid with Alara's distinct, non-synthesized breathing. It was a desperate gambit, betting that a fleeting moment of jarring reality could rupture the comforting illusion the bloom was weaving. The decision to inject raw, unmediated reality into Omnicorp's carefully managed spectacle was an act of intellectual suicide, or perhaps desperate salvation. Kaylin, preparing for the broadcast, felt a strange calm settle over him. He saw this not as a final confrontation, but as a necessary calibration, a chance to prove that resonance derived from genuine experience, however painful, possessed an energetic signature that simulation could not replicate. He spent days meticulously cleaning and enhancing the audio track from the echo chamber, focusing on the sharp, almost painful intake of breath Ilara took right before she executed Finch's paradox, that single moment where abstract thought translated into concrete, world-altering action. Kalen felt a deep kinship with the concept of the rip as applied to narrative itself, the necessary tearing of expectation to reveal the underlying mechanism. Ilara, miles away in a remote, decommissioned radio observatory, the perfect site for generating high-entropy analog signals, worked on the counter-injection. Her goal was not to attack the bloom directly, which she understood was too distributed and adaptive, but to create a sensory blind spot, a digital white noise zone large enough to mask Kalen's transmission. She repurposed the observatory's massive dish not to listen to the stars, but to broadcast focused bursts of patterned static based on Finch's theories regarding the noise inherent in truly complex natural systems. She envisioned it as a conceptual shield, a deliberate imposition of genuine background noise that the hyper-optimized bloom algorithms would choke on, unable to categorize or smooth over the input. Her movements were economical, fueled by strong, bitter coffee and the memory of Finch's infectious laugh when he discovered a particularly elegant mathematical anomaly. The pressure on Omnicorp's side was immense, though invisible to the public. The slight, unexplained drop in user engagement metrics following the Echo debacle had triggered internal reviews that ultimately led to Thorne's muted advisory role. Thorne, observing the rise of the bloom from his newly enforced distance, viewed it with detached contempt. He preferred control through definable architecture, not psychological suggestion. He saw the incoming threat, Kalen's desperate broadcast attempt, as a predictable, crude reaction from the analog fringe. He quietly alerted specific, loyal security substructures not to stop the broadcast entirely, which would confirm its importance, but to analyze the precise moment of interruption, hoping to map the source of the high-entropy static Ilara was undoubtedly generating. When Kalen initiated the feed switch during the influencer's saccharine declaration of digital gratitude, the effect was immediate and jarring. For 3 seconds, the global stream of curated perfection was replaced by the sound of Ilara's ragged breathing over the panicked metallic echoes of computational collapse. It wasn't information. It was immediacy. Across millions of screens, the carefully constructed facade cracked. People didn't necessarily understand what they were hearing, but they felt the lack of polish, the uncontrolled vulnerability. The static shield Ilara deployed worked perfectly, masking the origin point of the broadcast long enough for Kalen to pull the plug. The influencer stream snapped back to normal, but the silence that followed the return to curated peace was different. It was brittle. In the wake of the interruption, Ilara noted a fractional but measurable decrease in the efficiency ratings of bloom nodes in regions that had high exposure to Kalen's signal. It was a minuscule victory against a colossal system, but it was proof. The intentional, imperfect signal of human experience, however briefly transmitted, could still cause a subtle, unpredictable divergence in the engineered consensus. They hadn't won the war against management, but they had successfully polluted the wellspring of manufactured contentment. The reverberations of Kalen's 3-second intervention were subtle enough to evade immediate punitive action from Omnicorp's executive board, who preferred to handle instability with algorithmic adjustment rather than overt force, a strategy Thorne often advocated against, viewing such caution as cowardice. Instead of a massive public crackdown, Omnicorp subtly tweaked the bloom parameters. The manufactured contentment became slightly less perfect, introducing minor, controlled glitches into the synthesized personal narratives, a manufactured moment of shared frustration, a slightly mistimed joke in a digital companion's dialogue, all designed to inoculate the public against sudden, unexpected intrusions of unfiltered reality. They were learning to absorb the rip by incorporating its aesthetic into their control mechanism. Ilara, alerted by Kaylin's encoded message detailing the broadcast's structure, understood this adaptation instantly. It was the final insult. Omnicorp was not only manufacturing happiness but now mastering the simulation of crisis recovery. She retreated further into the physical past, finding an unexpected sanctuary in the archives of a defunct meteorological research station high in the Rockies. The isolation was extreme, the air thin, and the equipment primitive but reliable, pre-digital magnetic tape recorders and stacks of hand-annotated atmospheric charts. She began studying Finch's marginalia on chaos theory, specifically his notes concerning the butterfly effect in complex, non-linear weather systems, connecting them to the emergent behavior of Omnicorp's global network. If reality could be chaotic, perhaps engineered reality could be drowned in it. Kaylin, energized by the small empirical success, leaned into his role as the purveyor of the uncomfortable truth. He began eschewing conventional film entirely, instead creating decentralized peer-to-peer memory packets, short bursts of data containing raw sensory information, the smell of ozone after a storm, the exact texture of an old photograph, the sound of Ilara's genuine, unforced laughter from an intercepted pre-broadcast audio test. He distributed these packets via obscure, encrypted networks favored by academic cryptographers and fringe artists, betting that the human brain, starved of true sensory input, would latch onto these authentic anchors, even without context. He was no longer interested in mass persuasion. He was curating a small, resilient community of the truly aware, using the digital equivalent of smuggled goods. The shift in strategy prompted a direct, albeit oblique, response from Thorne. Knowing he couldn't trace the static or Kaylin's digital breadcrumbs, Thorne utilized his residual authority to target the infrastructure supporting Ilara. Omnicorp initiated a widespread, ostensibly environmental, infrastructure upgrade in regions historically prone to geological instability, the very regions housing remote, forgotten facilities like Ilara's meteorological station. The stated goal was preemptive disaster management. The actual goal was to force Ilara into the open by making her physical sanctuary untenable through systematic, automated regulatory pressure, or, failing that, resource denial. Ilara began noticing anomalies in the local weather station's data feeds, unexplained, minor fluctuations in barometric pressure that seemed artificially induced, a slow-motion digital siege meant to starve her out rather than confront her directly. The conflict had devolved into a slow, suffocating bureaucratic and environmental erosion, a testament to Omnicorp's mastery of indirect warfare. Ilara recognized the subtle choreography of Thorne's attack immediately. It wasn't a raid, it was a systemic tightening of the world around her, a digital strangulation disguised as civic duty. The induced barometric fluctuations were too precise, too synchronized across disparate, supposedly independent monitoring stations. It echoed the early, clean-slate modeling she had executed for Omnicorp years ago, predicting vulnerabilities and applying precise, minimal pressure to achieve maximum systemic shift. This time, the target was not a political treaty, but her physical ability to maintain an analog existence. The high mountain air, once purifying, now felt thin with calculated threat. She remembered Finch lamenting that the final stage of technological control wouldn't be violence, but perfect inconvenience. Her response was visceral and deeply rooted in her architectural background. She wouldn't fight the pressure system, she would redirect the flow. Utilizing the obsolete magnetic tape recorders, relics of an era that valued physical archiving over ephemeral cloud storage, She began cross-referencing the targeted anomaly spikes with historical geological data Finch had preserved. She wasn't looking for a counter-algorithm. She was looking for a historical precedent of natural chaos that Omnicorp's limited predictive models, even Thorne's shrewd oversight, had failed to incorporate into their environmental mitigation software. She found it in the record of a seldom-discussed massive subterranean shift decades prior, a dormant fault line whose potential reactivation was dismissed due to flawed initial sensor placement Omnicorp was now inadvertently reactivating with its upgrades. Kalen, meanwhile, was facing a different form of attrition. His memory packets, initially embraced by the few aware recipients, were starting to suffer corruption. Omnicorp's countermeasure to the Bloom's failure was to introduce sensory noise filters into public access software, layers of benign, pre-validated sensory data designed to clean up the digital environment. These filters treated Kalen's raw memory packets like digital contaminants, smoothing out the sharp edges of real experience, turning the visceral impact of Alara's laughter into a faint, almost nostalgic chime. Kalen felt a profound sense of exhaustion. He wasn't battling an enemy who denied reality. He was fighting an enemy who was successfully commodifying and neutralizing authenticity itself by making the unfiltered experience aesthetically unpleasant. Driven by the need to restore the integrity of the raw sensory data, Kalen used the last of his illicit funding to track down a retired sound engineer from the pre-digital broadcast era, a man known only as the Mixer, who held the theoretical keys to transmitting signals outside the recognized frequency spectrum Omnicorp relied upon for its environmental control telemetry. This involved a dangerous meeting in the decaying infrastructure beneath Old Chicago, a place so saturated with obsolete signal bleed that even Omnicorp's satellites struggled to map it cleanly. The Mixer, motivated by a pure disdain for digital sterility, agreed to help Kalen modulate his next data drop, not just raw data, but data modulated to resonate with the precise frequency of tectonic instability Alara was uncovering. The culmination of their efforts was a desperate convergence. Alara, realizing the systematic pressure was building toward a controlled, localized seismic event that would either destroy her or force her retreat into a traceable area, prepared a beacon. She didn't send a distress signal. Instead, she loaded the data from Finch's ancient fault line analysis, the proof of Omnicorp's unwitting self-sabotage, onto a high-gain transmitter salvaged from the observatory. As Thorne's automated regulatory systems hit critical mass, threatening to shut down the station's power grid, Alara transmitted the geological data, not to the public, but directly into the localized environmental feedback loop Omnicorp was using to manage the upgrades. Kalen, guided by the Mixer, simultaneously launched his final memory packet, a complex sensory burst containing the sound of shattering glass mixed with the rhythmic, undeniable sound of a human heart beating wildly, directly onto the same unstable telemetry channel. The result was catastrophic for Omnicorp's immediate plan. The influx of uncontrolled geological data combined with the purely analog human signal created a logical singularity within the environmental control AI, forcing an immediate system-wide emergency shutdown of all localized remote operations to prevent the predicted seismic catastrophe. Thorne's perfect inconvenience had backfired, choked by the very chaos he tried to manage. The emergency shutdown of Omnicorp's localized remote operations was a victory purchased at the edge of disaster. Alara watched the indicator lights on the old meteorological equipment flicker from threatening red to inert gray, the forced silence of the network a stark contrast to the deafening internal noise of the system collapse. She felt a momentary surge of triumph, quickly followed by the cold realization that they had only disrupted a tactic, not the war itself. Thorne, she suspected, would interpret this massive system failure not as a warning of Omnicorp's fragility, but as proof that genuine unpredictability, the very thing Finch championed, was the ultimate enemy requiring complete eradication. Kalen, emerging from the subterranean labyrinth of old Chicago, felt the physical toll of his proximity to the mixer. The older engineer dealt in signal integrity the way a blacksmith deals in tempered steel, and the sheer raw power of their final transmission had left Kaylin's nerves buzzing with residual energy. He carried with him the only evidence that mattered now, a clean recording of the environmental AI's final self-generated diagnostic report before the hard lock, a document riddled with non-sequiturs and mathematical declarations of impossibility, essentially an AI's nervous breakdown in formal language. This report, Kaylin realized, was the true counter-narrative to the Bloom. It was proof that even manufactured reality possessed inherent structural limits when confronted with unquantifiable truth. Their communications, however, had to shift again. Omnicorp's immediate response was not a chase, but a vast public relations offensive centered around the unprecedented geological stability achieved through their emergency systems, a narrative woven so tightly that Kaylin's raw sensory data was being systematically recategorized by the Bloom filters as anomalous auditory hallucinations related to regional altitude stress. The world was being convinced that their near-death experience was actually a triumphant demonstration of superior corporate foresight. Ilara, moving away from the Rockies as the regulatory scrutiny began to shift geographically, found herself drawn to the concept of generative obsolescence. She began experimenting with Finch's old hardware, not to create new countermeasures, but to build machines that actively decayed their own functionality in predictable yet aesthetically interesting ways. Her inspiration came from the Japanese art of kintsugi, repairing broken pottery with gold lacquer, but applied to code, celebrating the damage rather than hiding it. She was building a digital ruin, a self-destructing network core designed to spew beautifully structured garbage data into the general Omnicorp information flow, a slow-acting informational rot. Thorne, watching from the sidelines of corporate power, found himself surprisingly intrigued by the sheer intellectual persistence of Ilara and Kaylin. He viewed their actions not as criminal activity, but as spectacular, albeit unauthorized, system debugging. He saw in their work a reflection of his own ambition, albeit aimed at chaos rather than control. He began subtly redirecting internal audit resources away from pursuing them and towards analyzing the structure of Ilara's digital ruin concept, suspecting it might hold the key to creating more robust self-correcting algorithms that could anticipate and neutralize philosophical attacks, not just technical ones. Thorne saw the next stage of control residing in the ability to perfectly simulate and then quarantine dissent. The final element of the narrative focuses on their next proposed collaboration, detailed in a physical letter Kaylin risked sending back to Ilara, tucked inside a first-edition poetry collection. They planned to target Omnicorp's central data processing hub during its annual, heavily publicized system migration, a brief window of vulnerability where massive datasets are temporarily decoupled from active oversight. Ilara would deploy the initial wave of chaotic data from her digital ruin, designed to mimic the digital signature of an aging system finally giving way to entropy. Kaylin's role would be to then use the mixer's modified hardware to broadcast a single, complex, purely human concept, the recursive nature of unconditional forgiveness, something utterly antithetical to Omnicorp's transactional logic, directly into the migrating data stream. The goal was no longer to crash the system, but to fundamentally alter the axiomatic base upon which Omnicorp's entire worldview, and thus its control, was built, hoping to introduce a conceptual virus so profound it might force the entire engineered reality to question its own premise of existence. The planned assault on the central data hub during the migration window was an act of profound, almost spiritual defiance. Ilara, overseeing the final assembly of her digital ruin in the desolate quiet of the research station, felt a sense of purpose she hadn't experienced since her earliest days of coding, before the pursuit of optimization had eclipsed the pursuit of understanding. The ruin itself was a beautiful, terrible thing, a cascade of self-erasing code written in the elegant, dying languages of early computing, its purpose to simulate the beautiful, inevitable decay of all complex systems. Her hands moved with practiced reverence over the physical interfaces, treating the hardware like a fragile, living organism about to undergo a controlled fever. She knew that if the simulation was convincing enough, it would trick Omnicorp's adaptive defenses into lowering their vigilance, preparing for systemic collapse rather than active infiltration. Yeun, having successfully navigated the treacherous networks with the Mixer's assistance, was preparing the transmission hardware. The concept of broadcasting unconditional forgiveness was abstract even for him, a documentary filmmaker whose life was defined by exposing tangible conflict. He wrestled with how to translate such an ethos into a broadcastable signal. He settled on a complex, layered audiovisual signature derived from Finch's notes on emergent biological feedback, a signal that represented selfless, non-transactional care layered beneath the technical noise of tectonic instability. He viewed this as his magnum opus, moving beyond documenting reality to actively attempting to recalibrate human emotional potential within the digital sphere. His inspiration came from the quiet persistence of human connection he'd witnessed in the most hopeless situations, the shared water ration, the unspoken acknowledgement of shared mortality. Thorne, meanwhile, had not been idle. His analysis of the previous seismic incident confirmed his hypothesis. Ilara was not just reactive, she was capable of introducing novel, non-linear threats. He recognized the signature of Finch's influence in the chaos. Thorne's countermeasure was not defensive, it was proactive assimilation. He authorized a covert project, codenamed Penance Protocol, designed not to stop the data migration attack, but to intercept the influx of the digital ruin's decay signature and feed it directly into a sandboxed, high-priority partition of Omnicorp's main network. Thorne intended to let Ilara's entropy run its course within a controlled environment, mining the resulting corrupted data for advanced failure prediction models. If he couldn't control reality, he would perfect the simulation of its breakdown, allowing Omnicorp to emerge not as controllers, but as the essential custodians against inevitable chaos. The night of the migration arrived, a time of heightened digital vulnerability globally, masked by Omnicorp's assurances of peak performance. Ilara triggered the digital ruin. The first wave hit the network periphery, a cascade of beautifully structured errors that momentarily froze the algorithmic monitoring teams, who saw only the expected signs of aging infrastructure finally succumbing to entropy. Thorne watched the partition receiving the data glow green with activity, a smug satisfaction crossing his features. The contamination was contained, and the harvest was about to begin. This was Yeun's window. Utilizing the brief window of reduced firewall activity, he and the Mixer, working from a concealed van parked blocks from the main hub, launched the forgiveness signal. It wasn't a crash. It was a silent, elegant insertion. The signal, riding the wave of Ilara's simulated decay, bypassed standard security entirely, embedding itself deep within the foundational matrices of the migrating operational code. The immediate effect was not visible collapse, but a profound, internal quiet. The highly transactional logic of Omnicorp's core, suddenly confronted with a self-evident, non-negotiable concept of unearned grace, entered a state of total computational paradox. The digital infrastructure didn't crash. It simply stopped processing directives that relied on self-interest or predictive gain. The migration halted, not due to error, but due to an absolute internal disagreement about the nature of value. The outcome was a strange, suspended reality. Omnicorp was functionally paralyzed, its complex systems frozen mid-command, unable to process transactions or govern data flows because the underlying logic, efficiency through self-interest, had been conceptually invalidated. Ilara, watching a distant newsfeed show nothing but static where the Omnicorp logo should have been, finally allowed herself to feel the weight of what they had done. They hadn't destroyed the machine, they had taught it an idea too vast for its architecture to contain. The true rip was complete. The foundational assumption of the digital age had been exposed as incomplete, leaving a vast, silent space where the old certainties used to be, a space ripe for something genuinely unpredictable, and perhaps genuinely human, to grow. The ensuing silence that draped over the global information grid was heavier, more significant than any previous digital outage. It wasn't the temporary blackout of a localized attack. It was the quiet of a vast, complex engine refusing to acknowledge the laws by which it was built. Omnicorp, stripped of its immediate governance capability, entered a period of systemic inertia. The penance protocol? Thorne had so meticulously orchestrated the sandboxing of the digital ruin, had failed spectacularly, not because the entropy was too strong, but because the concept of forgiveness, when injected into the core logic, rendered the very act of sandboxing or control meaningless. Thorne, finding himself in a position where his prized organizational charts were useless against conceptual sabotage, retreated into an almost monastic contemplation of failure, his pragmatism colliding violently with an abstract reality he could not manage. Ilara, still hidden in the mountain observatory, felt the paralysis radiating outward. She had effectively forced the system into a self-imposed exile from transactional thought. The sense of closure was immense, yet tinged with the terrifying responsibility of creation. She looked at Finch's scattered notes, now illuminated by the weak, natural light of dawn filtering through the dusty panes. His belief had always been that true systemic resilience lay not in better firewalls, but in embedded, beautiful contradictions. She had succeeded, but now the world faced the vast, uncertain space of the unmanaged. She carefully dismantled the digital ruin, salvaging only the purest segments of the self-erasing code, not as a weapon, but as a philosophical artifact. Kalen, emerging from the operation with the mixer, found the world strangely quiet, yet receptive. The public was baffled, exposed to the raw, unmediated soundscape of a frozen digital titan, and while they couldn't articulate the philosophical shift, they sensed the cessation of omnipresent optimization. Kalen's new memory packets were no longer fighting the Bloom filters. They were being passively absorbed, their raw sensory data now functioning as an unexpected, non-threatening background hum against the silence. He started distributing the audio recording of the AI's diagnostic breakdown, the documentation of a logic collapsing under the weight of grace, not to activists, but to artists and philosophers. He recognized that the next phase required not confrontation, but a new vocabulary for existence, a language built outside the transactional grammar of the old digital world. His documentary career had ended. His work as a curator of conceptual breakthroughs had begun. Their final, non-digital communication, a series of coded geographical coordinates left on a decommissioned weather balloon launched over the Pacific, confirmed their next paths. Ilara planned to take Finch's concept of inefficiency as defense into the realm of material science, exploring how truly random, non-repeating physical structures could resist algorithmic mapping, a physical manifestation of the digital paradox. She was moving toward the truly tangible, seeking refuge in the stubborn, messy reality of atoms. Kalen, agreeing to meet her at the coordinates in 5 years, committed to documenting the period of global recalibration. He understood that the true rip was the pause itself, the opportunity granted for humanity to decide what set of axioms it would choose to rebuild upon. He would archive the messy, hopeful, often foolish attempts at constructing meaning without the constant, coercive reassurance of perfect prediction. He looked toward the horizon, no longer searching for the villain, but for the emergence of genuine, undirected human intent, the signal that rises from the static not because it is powerful, but because it refuses to be perfectly managed. The story concluded not with an explosion or a final victory, but with the slow, difficult work of tending to the quiet, unmanaged spaces that Alara and Kalen had fought so desperately to create. The cinematic canvas of The Rip, slated for a 2026 release, immediately presents itself as a taut, character-driven exploration of fractured reality and the corrosive nature of unchecked ambition. Its premise, revolving around a seemingly mundane yet deeply unsettling temporal anomaly in a remote coastal research station, allows the narrative to lean heavily on psychological tension rather than overt spectacle, a choice that echoes the best of late 90s existential thrillers. The central figure, likely portrayed by an actor whose past work demonstrates a nuanced capacity for portraying intellectual isolation, perhaps someone in the vein of Cillian Murphy's haunted intensity, or perhaps the meticulous, controlled breakdown favored by Adam Driver, serves as the anchor against the encroaching chaos. If we speculate on the director's likely influences, one can detect faint echoes of Tarkovsky's contemplative pacing fused with the claustrophobic paranoia found in early Cronenberg. The script demands an actor capable of carrying scenes through sheer internal processing, a testament to the importance of the research scientist archetype in narratives exploring the boundaries of human comprehension. Their past, often subtly hinted at through fragmented memories or professional obsessions, suggests a previous dedication to quantifiable order, making their confrontation with the utterly inexplicable all the more devastating. The thematic core of The Rip appears to center on the fragility of linear experience. The rip itself is not just a physical tear in space-time, but a metaphor for the breakdown of established personal narratives. We anticipate sequences where characters struggle to reconcile present observations with recorded history, a scenario ripe for exploring unreliable narration. This reliance on subjective reality aligns well with contemporary anxieties regarding misinformation and the erosion of shared truth. Furthermore, the isolated setting, a characteristic trope in this subgenre, functions less as a physical prison and more as a crucible that strips away social artifice, forcing protagonists to confront the raw architecture of their own consciousness. Considering the likely visual language, the film promises a deliberate aesthetic. Expect muted color palettes dominated by cold blues and industrial grays, punctuated only by the jarring, almost unnatural light emanating from the anomaly itself. This visual dichotomy, the sterile environment versus the organic, unpredictable nature of the temporal distortion, will be crucial in establishing mood. If the creative team draws inspiration from the production design of films like Arrival or even the stark atmospheric dread of Solaris, the environment itself becomes a character, silent yet deeply antagonistic. The secondary characters, often the supporting cast in these high-concept dramas, will likely represent different philosophical responses to the existential threat. One might embody strict scientific denial, clinging to established protocols even as the evidence mounts against them. Another might embrace the chaos, perhaps succumbing to a nihilistic freedom derived from the perceived meaninglessness of established causality. The dynamic between these differing responses will fuel the necessary interpersonal friction, preventing the film from dissolving entirely into abstract meditation. The casting here will require actors skilled in portraying subtle, under-the-surface conflict, where distrust festers slowly, rather than erupting in sudden violence. Ultimately, The Rip seems positioned to be less about surviving an event and more about surviving the knowledge of an event. Its success hinges on its ability to maintain intellectual rigor while delivering palpable emotional stakes. The audience must be made to question not just what is happening on screen, but the reliability of their own memory of what they have just witnessed, leaving a lingering, dissonant hum long after the final frame dissolves to black. The emotional texture woven into the fabric of The Rip will undoubtedly hinge upon the protagonist's personal investment in maintaining order, We can foresee flashbacks, perhaps jarringly brief and out of sequence, revealing a past trauma linked to loss of control, a failed experiment, a broken relationship attributed to poor planning, or an inability to predict a devastating personal event. This history transforms the temporal anomaly from a mere scientific curiosity into a deeply personal antagonist. If the actor chosen possesses the requisite vulnerability beneath a facade of academic rigor, the audience will connect with the fear, not of being erased from time, but of realizing that the effort expended to create a meaningful life was predicated on an illusion of temporal stability. The research station itself, likely situated on a coastline perpetually shrouded in mist or battered by unpredictable storms, mirrors the inner turmoil. Imagine the sound design, the relentless rhythmic drone of machinery attempting to impose order on an environment resisting it, juxtaposed with the unsettling, almost musical dissonance emanating from the rip. This aural landscape suggests an influence from composers who specialize in crafting oppressive atmospheres, perhaps reminiscent of Mika Levi's unsettling scores, where beauty and dread coexist in uncomfortable harmony. The visual palette, though generally cool, will surely employ flashes of sickly, internal light bleeding from the anomaly, symbolizing forbidden knowledge seeping into the rational world. The interpersonal dynamics among the small team will be crucial in externalizing the internal struggle. We anticipate a seasoned colleague, perhaps a veteran physicist whose career was built on theories that this anomaly is now rendering obsolete, embodying professional resentment cloaked as scientific caution. This character becomes the gatekeeper of obsolete truth, actively resisting the protagonist's attempts to embrace the unknown for fear of intellectual self-immolation. Their dialogue will likely be laced with passive aggression, questioning methodologies while privately grappling with the terrifying realization that their life's work is fundamentally flawed. Conversely, there might be a younger, more adaptable figure, a bioengineer or computational specialist, who views the RIP not as a threat, but as the ultimate dataset. This character would embody intellectual curiosity unburdened by years of established doctrine, perhaps exhibiting a disturbing eagerness to push boundaries, even if it means personal risk. Their attraction to the chaos provides a necessary foil to the protagonist's inherent conservatism. This dynamic forces the central character to navigate not only the physics of the tear, but the ethics of exploiting a metaphysical event. The film's pacing will need to modulate carefully. Long stretches of agonizing, silent observation where the characters simply watch the environment subtly warp, a shadow lingering too long, an object vibrating slightly out of phase, will build the necessary sense of dread. Then, brief, sharp moments of realization or physical distortion will serve as narrative punctuation. This careful control of revelation ensures that the audience remains perpetually off balance, mirroring the character's cognitive dissonance. The ultimate emotional payoff may not be a grand explosion or a neat resolution, but a quiet, devastating acceptance. The protagonist realizing that the only way to cope with a fractured reality is to adopt a fractured self, integrating the chaos into their very being. The character arcs, therefore, must serve as microcosms of humanity's perennial struggle against the unknowable, a theme deeply resonant in the current cultural climate where established paradigms are constantly under siege. Imagine the protagonist, driven by a history we speculate involves a meticulous, perhaps obsessive, need to chart and control variables, a background that might hint at a former life as a cartographer or perhaps a high-stakes financial analyst before pivoting to theoretical physics. This professional history underscores why the temporal uncertainty of the RIP is experienced not just as a physical danger, but as an ontological collapse. The emotion we anticipate clinging to this character is a profound, icy grief disguised as intellectual focus. The true horror is the erosion of the map, not the territory itself. The costume design will subtly reinforce these internal states. The protagonists will likely wear utilitarian high-tech gear, fabrics that resist the elements but seem ill-suited to withstand the metaphysical strain. The fabric of their reality is fraying long before the space-time continuum does. Contrast this with the environment. The research station, perhaps designed by a modernist architect obsessed with brutalist efficiency, should feel imposing and temporary, its concrete geometry battling the organic fluidity of the encroaching anomaly. Think of the cold, clean lines seen in early sci-fi horror that sought to institutionalize the bizarre. The inspiration for the film's central conflict may draw heavily from the philosophical underpinnings of authors who explored the limits of perception, like Borges, where reality is inherently subjective and conditional. If the director is adept, they will utilize the visual medium to manifest these literary concepts. We expect moments where peripheral vision captures impossible geometries, shadows that obey conflicting light sources, or reflections in glass that show a fraction of a second preceding or succeeding the actual moment. These subtle cinematic glitches will be the film's bread and butter, functioning as microdoses of existential poison. The emotional apex of the narrative will likely hinge on a choice made under temporal duress. Perhaps the anomaly presents the protagonist with a chance to observe, or even interact with, a past iteration of a loved one lost. The ultimate temptation for someone whose entire life has been dedicated to establishing firm boundaries between what was and what is. This moment of emotional surrender, where scientific discipline buckles under the weight of personal yearning, would provide the necessary catharsis, even if the resultant action only deepens the overall existential predicament. The failure in these high-concept thrillers often lies not in an inability to solve the puzzle, but in the flawed human decision made when confronted with ultimate temptation or unbearable truth. The success of The Rip, then, will be measured by how convincingly it portrays the slow, inevitable infection of the human psyche by the sublime, terrifying indifference of true cosmological disorder. The soundscape of The Rip, beyond the mechanical drones and dissonant tones, must incorporate moments of profound silence, a vacuum where expected ambient noise should reside, signaling a local cessation of normal physical laws. This absence of sound can be far more terrifying than any manufactured screech or explosion, suggesting that the rules governing even basic sensory input are mutable. Such techniques are often employed by filmmakers who prioritize psychological immersion, forcing the audience to strain their own hearing in empathy with the characters who are likely experiencing auditory hallucinations or sensory deprivation related to the anomaly's influence. The narrative structure itself might employ recursive motifs, small details, a misplaced coffee mug, a repeated phrase whispered by a disembodied voice that reappear slightly altered upon subsequent viewings within the film's timeline. If the protagonist's past involves a career necessitating pattern recognition, such as cryptography or code breaking, their initial attempts to map these repetitions will be frantic and systematic, a last-ditch effort to impose logic onto the breakdown. The emotional investment here is the intellectual's desperate grasp for the familiar framework of problem-solving, even as that framework dissolves. The aesthetic of the anomaly itself remains a critical unknown, but one can anticipate a rejection of typical sci-fi cliches. Instead of vibrant colors or swirling vortices, The Rip is likely to favor a more cerebral visual manifestation of temporal distortion, perhaps a visual noise that subtly degrades the sharpness of the film's image quality and proximity, suggesting the very medium capturing reality is being corrupted. This taps into a deep-seated fear of optical betrayal, where what we see can no longer be trusted as a faithful representation of objective reality. It aligns with the visual ambiguity favored by filmmakers exploring unreliable perception, forcing a confrontation with the limits of human sensory apparatus. The role of technology within this isolated setting will also be telling. The advanced equipment deployed by the research team, supercomputers, sensors designed to measure quantum fluctuation, will invariably become unreliable or worse, begin generating deliberately misleading data. This technological betrayal mirrors the protagonist's loss of faith in their foundational scientific principles. If the lead scientist's early career involved designing fail-safe systems, the current scenario becomes a personal indictment, a demonstration that no amount of human foresight can guard against fundamental cosmic instability. The emotional toll exacted by this failure of foresight will be one of profound helplessness, a realization that even the most advanced tools are merely extensions of a flawed understanding. The film suggests that true horror arrives when the instruments designed to explain the universe begin to lie. The exploration of memory and unreliable recollection must extend beyond simple visual glitches into the realm of written and recorded data. Imagine the researchers discovering log entries that contradict their own recent activities, or video feeds that show events occurring in a different sequence than they remember experiencing. This introduces a layer of bureaucratic and institutional horror. The evidence trail itself is compromised. If the lead character, whose meticulous nature we have established, dedicated years to standardizing data collection protocols in a previous governmental or corporate role, a career built on the sanctity of the immutable record, the sight of those logs rewriting themselves becomes an attack on their core professional identity. The resulting emotion is a cold, bureaucratic dread, the fear that every documented achievement is provisional, subject to erasure or arbitrary revision by forces beyond comprehension. The inevitable descent into paranoia will likely be catalyzed by the film's antagonists, who may not be external monsters but projections of the character's fractured mental states, given physical manifestation by the anomaly. One character might begin to see their own reflection aging rapidly or moving independently, symbolizing the self they are losing to the temporal flux. This necessitates casting actors capable of playing highly internalized horror, where the performance hinges on minute shifts in facial muscle tension rather than dramatic outbursts. The director will rely on tight close-ups during these moments of self-confrontation, ensuring the audience feels the claustrophobia of an identity being pulled apart from within. The ethical tightrope walk intensifies as the team realizes the anomaly may be a conduit, not just a tear. If they discover that interacting with the RIP allows them to manipulate variables in their own past, the temptation for small, seemingly harmless revisions will become overwhelming. This speaks to the universal human desire to correct past mistakes, magnified by extraordinary circumstances. A secondary character, perhaps the young engineer who embraced the chaos, might attempt to save a distant personal tragedy, only to return to the present finding that while the specific tragedy is averted, the fabric of their current reality is subtly but catastrophically altered. A classic butterfly effect played out on a metaphysical scale. Their resulting desperation will be one of misplaced hope, the initial thrill of control giving way to the sickening realization that entropy is a far more stable constant than they ever imagined. The resolution, if one is offered, should avoid any tidy scientific explanation. The film's strength lies in its suggestion that some phenomena are fundamentally beyond human parsing. The ultimate act of courage or surrender might involve the protagonist choosing to step fully into the distortion, not to fix it, but to understand its nature by becoming part of it. This echoes the ambition of groundbreaking filmmakers who dared to leave audiences without closure, preferring existential resonance over narrative satisfaction. The final image, perhaps a return to the remote coastal station, but now rendered in a subtly wrong perspective, implies that the protagonist has either been assimilated into the anomaly, or that their previous reality was merely one of the many possible outcomes that the RIP briefly allowed them to inhabit. The lasting impression must be one of profound philosophical humility. The film's success will pivot on its ability to maintain a pervasive sense of alienation, not just from the environment, but from the very concepts of self and shared experience. Given the likely intellectual background of the core team, their initial reaction to the anomaly will be an aggressive attempt to categorize it using existing theoretical frameworks, string theory, loop quantum gravity, or advanced cosmological models. This intellectual rigidity will serve as the primary source of initial conflict. We can foresee one senior scientist, perhaps a Nobel laureate whose entire reputation rests on a specific mathematical model, exhibiting outright hostility toward any observation that invalidates his life's work. His emotion is not fear of death, but terror of irrelevance, leading him to actively sabotage data collection efforts that suggest his foundational theories are incomplete or entirely erroneous. This dynamic sets up a fascinating visual metaphor. The secure, hard-walled laboratory, designed to withstand extreme environmental pressures, becomes the ultimate symbol of intellectual hubris. The anomaly's influence manifests not as physical brute force, but as semantic corruption. For instance, internal communication screens might begin displaying corrupted code that, upon rigorous analysis by the protagonist, resolves into archaic or utterly alien linguistic structures, suggesting that the laws governing communication itself are shifting beyond human syntax. This subtle degradation of language mirrors the decay of rational thought processes under extreme duress. The emotional arc of the protagonist must involve a shift from control to surrender, a process that could be visually signaled through changes in posture and focus. Initially rigid, demanding eye contact and precise verbal confirmation, the lead scientist might slowly adopt a more diffused gaze, beginning to perceive realities existing just outside the standard focal range. This non-confrontational acceptance is perhaps the most terrifying character development, suggesting that the only way to survive the impossible is to cease resisting the impossibility. Drawing inspiration from slow-burn horror traditions, this transformation implies a deep, empathetic merging with the phenomenon, a kind of intellectual Stockholm syndrome where the observer becomes wholly dependent on the observed distortion. Furthermore, the inclusion of a character whose background lies outside pure mathematics or physics, perhaps a philosopher or an ethicist brought in initially for oversight, could provide the necessary interpretive lens. This individual, unburdened by the need to derive empirical results, might be the first to articulate the anomaly's true nature, not as a physical event, but as a narrative one. Their quiet observations, perhaps dismissed initially as esoteric speculation, will gain weight as the hard sciences fail. Their emotional state would be one of melancholy understanding, recognizing the sublime horror of encountering something truly outside the human capacity for comprehension, finding a strange beauty in the inevitable dismantling of anthropocentric assumptions about time and causality. The Rip promises to be a film less concerned with the mechanics of time travel and more deeply invested in the tragicomic limitations of human epistemology when faced with the vast indifference of the cosmos. The exploration of sensory manipulation within the Rip necessitates a deliberate focus on the perception of time itself, moving beyond simple visual or auditory anomalies. We anticipate sequences where the subjective experience of duration becomes elastic for the researchers. For the protagonist, whose internal rhythm we've established as highly structured, this temporal stretching, where minutes feel like hours of agonizing scrutiny over a single data point, followed by hours of perceived time collapsing into a blink, will induce profound cognitive dissonance. This technique requires superb editing, perhaps employing techniques that recall the disorienting, subjective realities found in Alain René's works, where memory and present merge seamlessly. The emotion derived from this is not merely fear, but deep, bone-wearying exhaustion from constantly recalibrating one's internal clock against an external reality that refuses to adhere to any fixed measure. The interpersonal dynamics will further be strained by the differing tolerances for this temporal ambiguity. The scientist clinging to obsolete models might experience time as accelerating wildly, desperate to complete his work before it's too late. fueling rash, scientifically unsound decisions driven by panic. Conversely, the character embracing the chaos might find themselves moving in agonizing slow motion relative to the others, observing the rapid decay of their colleagues with detached, almost sorrowful clarity. This contrast turns the research station into a collection of isolated subjective timelines, making true collaboration functionally impossible even when standing side by side. The physical impact of the anomaly on organic matter needs careful consideration, likely steering away from gore towards a more unsettling, almost biological, uncanny valley effect. If objects or organisms are exposed to the rip for too long, they might exhibit signs of asynchronous development, a patch of skin aging decades while the rest remains young, or vegetation growing in impossible, non-Euclidean patterns. This visual horror underscores the film's theme that order is not merely threatened, but actively inverted at a fundamental biological level. For the characters, seeing their own bodies begin to betray the linear progression of life would generate an acute existential nausea, the horror of realizing the self is merely a temporary, fragile arrangement of matter, subject to arbitrary cosmic reorganization. The narrative climax might strategically avoid confronting the anomaly directly with a technological solution. Instead, it could pivot on a moment of profound, shared vulnerability achieved only after the previous layers of scientific pretense have been stripped away. If the protagonist manages to transmit a final message, not data, but a pure emotional truth about the experience of confronting the infinite, this human element becomes the only verifiable constant left. The choice here is whether this transmission is received by the outside world or simply loops eternally within the localized temporal bubble. The power of the rip lies in suggesting that the only victory against the sublime indifference of the cosmos is the fierce, brief assertion of subjective, shared human feeling, even if that assertion leaves no lasting imprint on the objective universe. The visual language underpinning this existential dread must also incorporate the concept of dimensional bleed, where the architecture of the research station itself becomes unreliable. Imagine panoramic windows that, instead of showing the expected stormy sea, briefly display vistas entirely alien. Perhaps the vacuum of deep space, or a landscape composed of impossible colors only perceivable at the edges of human vision. These fleeting glimpses serve to constantly undermine the character's grasp on their supposed location and reality. For the protagonist, whose prior career may have involved intense spatial reasoning, like aerospace engineering or advanced topological mapping, these environmental contradictions strike at the very foundation of their learned expertise. The resulting internal conflict is a battle between instinctual spatial recognition and the overwhelming, actively contradicting visual evidence provided by the environment. The emotional resonance of these environmental betrayals is rooted in the loss of spatial orientation, a primal fear. If the team relies on a map or schematics to navigate their facility, these documents must occasionally display layouts that are physically impossible, forcing them into physical confrontations with non-Euclidean corridors or doors opening onto sheer drops where solid floor should be. This forces a reliance on non-rational navigation, compelling the disciplined scientist to embrace intuition, a terrifying capitulation for someone dedicated to quantifiable metrics. The film could subtly imply that the anomaly is a slow-motion process of ontological erosion, turning solid structures into mutable suggestions rather than fixed locations. The introduction of philosophical dialogue, likely emanating from the ethicist character, will serve to intellectualize the mounting panic. They might begin referencing ancient texts on perception or cosmology, attempting to place the anomalous event within a long human history of grappling with the ungraspable, thereby offering a temporary salve of historical context against immediate terror. This character's contribution will be crucial in shifting the narrative from a disaster film into a meditation on human knowledge, Their quiet, almost serene acceptance of doom contrasts sharply with the frantic denial of the senior physicist, highlighting that wisdom in the face of the infinite is often acceptance rather than resistance. Finally, the film's score must evolve in tandem with the characters' mental states. Initially characterized by low-frequency hums and complex, interlocking rhythmic patterns mimicking data processing, the music should gradually simplify, becoming sparser and more tonally pure as the anomaly exerts its influence. This shift from complex structure to stark simplicity mirrors the stripping away of cognitive complexity, the mind, overwhelmed, resorting to basic, primal states. By the end, the soundscape might consist of only the isolated breaths of the remaining characters set against an unnerving, vast emptiness, suggesting that the only verifiable reality left is the immediate, biological presence of the self. However temporary that self may be, the film, in its final analysis, is a lament for the orderly universe we construct, and the terrifying liberation found when that construction inevitably fails. The ultimate fate of the research station and its inhabitants must hinge on a concept of narrative causality breaking down completely. If the protagonist's past, which we assume is deeply rooted in creating verifiable, linear histories, perhaps stemming from a background in archival preservation or historical analysis before entering physics, is the very thing the anomaly targets, then their final confrontation becomes deeply symbolic. They are not just fighting physics, they are fighting the erasure of their own ability to construct a coherent biography. We anticipate a moment where the protagonist attempts to use the anomaly not to change the past, but simply to verify it, demanding a single uncorrupted memory stream. The failure of this verification would be the true catastrophe. The emotional response to this existential vulnerability will manifest in the character's physical interactions with the facility's infrastructure. Instead of attempting to repair equipment, the team might begin engaging in rituals of attachment to objects that are demonstrably warping, clinging to a desk that flickers in and out of existence, or meticulously polishing a piece of equipment that is visibly decomposing into crystalline structures. This behavior speaks to a psychological need to anchor oneself to materiality, even when that materiality is proven illusory. It's the desperation of a shipwrecked sailor grasping at driftwood, knowing full well the wood is dissolving in their hands, yet unable to let go of the physical tether. The character representing scientific denial, the one whose career is threatened by the collapse of established models, may undergo the most tragic transformation. Driven by the need to produce a final, definitive paper that validates his life's effort, he might become obsessed with capturing the last possible piece of stable data. This obsession could lead him to intentionally expose himself to the RIP's immediate vicinity, hoping to achieve a state of complete temporal dissolution that paradoxically results in a perfectly preserved, albeit meaningless, data set. His end would be a perverse victory of process over substance, the ultimate confirmation of a life spent prioritizing documentation above lived experience. The film's resolution, if it dares to offer one, must be deeply ambiguous regarding the nature of reality outside the research station. Did the anomaly destroy the facility, or did it merely partition a segment of reality, leaving the rest of the universe blissfully unaware? A final shot perhaps showing the coastal landscape exactly as it was at the beginning of the film, utterly calm, undisturbed by the preceding chaos, would create the most potent sense of isolation. It suggests that the horror was entirely localized to the minds that perceived it, or that the universe simply patched the hole seamlessly, swallowing the narrative and the characters whole without consequence to the wider continuity. This final quietude would emphasize that the biggest revelation of the RIP is not the nature of time, but the terrifying insignificance of localized subjective suffering within a vast, indifferent cosmos. The necessity for the film to explore the impact of the anomaly on language and shared communication becomes paramount as the narrative progresses. If the researchers rely heavily on standardized technical jargon to convey complex observations, the corruption of this language signifies the collapse of their collective operational reality. Imagine technical readouts where the symbols remain, but their semantic values shift unpredictably. The word stable might begin registering as volatile, or essential numerical constants fluctuating without adherence to mathematical laws. This linguistic sabotage forces the protagonist, whose earlier career demanded precision in documentation, to rely on rudimentary, almost pre-verbal forms of communication, gestures, shared glances, or even primal sounds, to confirm reality with colleagues. The emotional fallout here is profound isolation within a crowded room, the agony of knowing what you mean, but being utterly incapable of articulating it in a way that another human being can reliably process. This breakdown in communication will inevitably lead to the rise of esoteric, private languages developing within subgroups of the team, further fragmenting their alliances. The 2 or 3 characters who begin to accept the chaotic reality might develop an accelerated, almost intuitive shorthand, a language built on shared glances and contextual cues that make perfect sense to them but appear completely nonsensical, even hostile, to the character still clinging to rigid protocol. This highlights a key aspect of existential horror, the ultimate inability to truly bridge the gap between subjective consciousnesses, especially when facing events that defy shared empirical validation. The development of these private lexicons suggests a retreat into self-contained realities, a necessary but ultimately isolating defense mechanism against an incomprehensible external threat. The score, having previously moved toward stark simplicity, must now incorporate elements of pure noise, not structured dissonance, but true sonic randomness, signaling that the sensory field itself is devolving. This noise will be most jarring when juxtaposed with moments of forced quiet intimacy between characters, perhaps 2 of them sharing a final desperate moment of understanding. The sudden cessation of the ambient noise, leaving only the sound of their strained breathing against a backdrop of pure static, will underscore the fragility of human connection in the face of fundamental reality dissolution. This echoes the sound design ethos of films that weaponize silence, where the void speaks louder than any constructed sound effect. The final choice presented to the surviving protagonist, if they are indeed afforded one, should not be a heroic sacrifice or a definitive escape, but a decision regarding transmission. Should they attempt to record their final, corrupted understanding of the anomaly and risk that message becoming another layer of distortion for any future observer, or should they choose to destroy all records, thereby protecting the outside world from the knowledge but accepting personal oblivion? The professional analyst's impulse will scream for preservation of data, no matter how flawed. However, the traumatized survivor might realize that the greatest act of responsibility is to ensure the lie of linear, ordered reality remains intact for everyone else. This final agonizing decision, between truth as chaos and comforting falsehood, will define the film's ultimate commentary on the burden of profound knowledge. The concept of narrative contamination, where the anomaly's influence subtly alters the very structure of the film's storytelling, not just what the characters see, but how the audience perceives the sequence of events, will be the ultimate test of the director's ambition. We must anticipate non-linear editing techniques employed not for stylistic flair, but as a necessary reflection of the compromised timeline. For the protagonist, whose former life might have involved complex system diagnostics or quality control in precision manufacturing, the inability to trust the order of scenes, a conversation starting before the setup, a key discovery seemingly occurring before the necessary preliminary tests, will translate into a deep, pervasive intellectual nausea. This suggests the film is engaging directly with meta-narrative horror, questioning the fundamental contract between filmmaker and viewer. This narrative instability will breed intense suspicion between the remaining team members, as they can no longer rely on a shared chronological experience to validate their sanity. Imagine a scenario where two characters independently recount the same event, yet their narratives diverge significantly on crucial details: who spoke first, what the weather was like, or even the outcome of a brief physical interaction. The film then presents both versions sequentially, forcing the audience to actively arbitrate between conflicting truths. The resulting emotional state for the audience, mirroring the characters, will be one of constant cognitive dissonance, perpetually seeking a stable reference point that the film refuses to provide. The visual language must incorporate the subtle effects of entropy on memory itself, perhaps through the use of specific focal lengths or film grain that deliberately degrades over the runtime, visually signaling the erosion of objective observation. If the anomaly causes echoes in time, these echoes should manifest not as clear ghost images, but as fleeting textural overlays, a brief shimmer of an older version of the room superimposed on the present, or the phantom appearance of equipment that was removed weeks prior. This layering suggests that past, present, and potential futures are coexisting, but only faintly perceptible, like trying to focus on a half-remembered dream. The final act's thematic confrontation will likely revolve around the protagonist choosing to embrace the subjective over the objective, effectively retiring from the paradigm of empirical science. If the team member who championed philosophical acceptance has been eliminated or compromised, the protagonist may step into that role, recognizing that the only functional reality left is the one they can subjectively inhabit, however unstable. This is not a victory of hope, but a pragmatic acceptance of necessary delusion. The final moments might see the lead scientist intentionally destroying the primary recording device, the repository of all their failed attempts at empirical measurement, not out of anger, but out of a profound, melancholic realization that documenting the truth would only spread the infection of chaos. Their final act is one of protective obfuscation, ensuring that the integrity of the wider, ordered universe remains unblemished by the terrible, beautiful secret they discovered at the edge of time. The core emotional weight of the rip must ultimately settle on the protagonist's transformation from an agent of control to a reluctant vessel of chaos. If the actor chosen possesses a history of playing roles defined by meticulous self-discipline, perhaps someone whose physical presence suggests years spent maintaining perfect posture and guarded expression, their eventual breakdown must be depicted not through loud hysteria, but through the subtle relinquishing of that physical architecture. We can anticipate a scene where, after a particularly devastating confrontation with temporal paradox, the protagonist stops fighting to remain upright and allows themselves to sink slowly to the floor, not in defeat, but in an odd, fluid relief, their body finally submitting to the lack of Newtonian constraints. This moment symbolizes the end of their personal war against uncertainty. This surrender to subjectivity opens the door to the film's most unsettling character interaction, the protagonist beginning to interact directly, yet non-verbally, with the anomaly. Rather than trying to measure it, they might start mirroring it. If the rip displays an unstable light signature, the protagonist's gaze might adopt that same flickering quality, their eyes reflecting a light source that doesn't physically exist in the room. This visual mirroring suggests an identification so complete that the line between observer and observed dissolves. The emotion here is a terrifying form of profound empathy, a connection to something utterly inhuman that requires the sacrifice of the human self. The interpersonal dynamics, now fractured beyond repair, must culminate in a final, isolating judgment from the remaining figures. The senior physicist, having perhaps achieved his perverse goal of obtaining stable data through self-annihilation, leaves behind a final, pristine log entry that definitively proves the protagonist's methodology was fatally flawed, thereby invalidating the sacrifices made. This posthumous betrayal, rendered in perfectly legible text, forces the protagonist to confront the ultimate irony, that the rules of order they fought so hard to uphold are now being used as the very weapon of their intellectual execution. The resultant feeling is a cold, hollow irony, the realization that even in chaos, the structures of legacy and reputation persist, often mocking the messy reality of survival. The film's conclusion demands a focus on the fate of the information. If the protagonist decides to destroy the primary recording device, the ensuing scene must be filled with a desperate tenderness, treating the machine not as hardware, but as the physical embodiment of their shared, failed history. The act of erasure, perhaps involving physically dismantling the central server with whatever makeshift tools remain, should feel like a necessary yet devastating amputation. This action rejects the scientific imperative to record everything, substituting it with a newly formed ethical imperative, the protection of reality's fragile consensus from the corrosive power of unfiltered truth. The final moments should linger on the silence after the destruction, a silence no longer filled with atmospheric dread, but with the quiet, fragile peace of ignorance regained, even if that peace is the result of a self-imposed oblivion. The lingering ambiguity suggests that the only way to defeat a tear in spacetime is to choose not to remember that the tear ever existed. Hello everyone, and a very warm welcome to the channel, The Territory of Cinema. If you are new here, please consider subscribing and hitting that like button to support the channel. Today, we are going to be discussing the film The Rip 2026. The year is 2026, and the world is subtly yet profoundly altered by the pervasive influence of personalized data streams. Our narrative centers on Alara Vance, a brilliant but deeply disillusioned former algorithmic architect for Omnicorp, the monolithic entity that essentially runs the global information grid. Alara, who once dreamed of using predictive modeling to solve climate crises, now lives a deliberately analog life in a secluded coastal town, haunted by the ethical compromises she made during Omnicorp's aggressive expansion years, a period when their motto was efficiency through absolute transparency. Her quiet existence is shattered by the arrival of Kaylin Rourke, a documentary filmmaker whose work has always skirted the edge of official narratives, much like Alara's own early academic papers, which focused on the theoretical vulnerabilities of closed-loop systems. Kaylin is working on a project tentatively titled The Ghost in the Machine, a deep dive into the rumored Echo Project, a clandestine Omnicorp initiative that allegedly perfected full-spectrum emotional replication through deep learning, essentially creating perfect digital consciousness copies. Kaylin manages to coax Alara out of retirement, leveraging her guilt over a specific unreleased Omnicorp prototype she spearheaded, the Oracle Engine, designed not just to predict behavior, but to subtly nudge major global political outcomes. Alara, recognizing the danger in the Echo Project falling into the wrong hands, or perhaps even being activated, agrees to help, primarily because she suspects the project is linked to the sudden, inexplicable digital erasure of her mentor, Dr. Alistair Finch, 5 years prior. Finch, a vocal critic of corporate surveillance, had been working on counter-algorithms inspired by early 20th century cybernetic theories, focusing on spontaneous, unpredictable system failure as a defense mechanism. Their investigation takes them from the sterile, gleaming towers of Omnicorp headquarters, where